Hi everybody, this is Mr. V. So I just wanted to say hello, make sure that you guys were doing okay. Wanted you to see my face, make sure you know I'm still here. And so I'm recording these lectures to, supplement us, see how long we have to go online and things like that. Hopefully it won't be for the rest of the semester, but either way we'll continue on. And I kind of wanted to just make sure you saw that I'm still here and that we're still going to be going through our lectures pretty much the way we have, only now this will be our main method of getting that information to you. So hopefully you'll continue to watch these. I'm going to also be making outlines with every chapter. And so that way you guys will be able to still pretend like we're in class and go through stuff. So, and the good thing now is you'll be able to do it on your own time and, still be able to see these as we go. So, but anyway, hopefully this carries on and that you do pretty good with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to it. All right, so this is all about chapter 24, the maintenance systems of the body. So this section is about the respiratory system. So the main thing to understand here is that this is all about getting two things passed through, basically oxygen and carbon dioxide. And there's different ways that we can do this, but the main thing for us in our closed circulatory system is by using exchanges with the blood. Okay, so the big deal here is that we're using blood to pass those gases back and forth through our respiratory system. Now, how it works is the blood ends up in little tiny capillaries, giving up carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen in those sections. So we do two things. We inspire and we expire. That's when we are breathing in and breathing out. And it's a way to exchange the external gases between the air, right? And then internally, we're able to use that to exchange the gases in the blood. And so using that, the main thing here is we're trying to get respiration to occur, okay? And we're trying to generate ATP. That's the main molecule we're trying to do with respiration. And so that's what this whole gas exchange system is all about. So the system we're using here to talk about at the beginning is all about breathing, okay? It's all about making sure that we can get that CO2 and that O2 to where it needs to go and getting the oxygen to the rest of the body, okay? And so for us, our respiratory tract is the thing that does this. It's a continuous pathway, basically getting things to the lungs as we need it. So as you can see, here's all the steps. It starts up at the nostril, okay? So when you're breathing something in, it goes through here, passes down past the nasal cavity, through the pharynx and the epiglottis and the glottis, down to the larynx where your voice is, or where your voice comes through, and then down the trachea, and then from here it separates into tiny tubes called the bronchus, right? But then they get smaller and they become the bronchioles, and then finally these little grape sac things we're going to get a close look at in a second. Those are your alveoli, and that's the stuff that actually does the exchange. And then of course it's super important to also note to the diaphragm down here. The diaphragm is a muscle that helps get that stuff. Helps expand and contract the lungs for the breathing. Okay, and so the main thing that we use here in our respiratory passage is cilia. Okay, so we have these little tiny cilia in our body, and it helps us by pushing air through, but it helps us also by filtering it and humidifying it, right? We need air to be semi-humid so that it can have that water that it needs, and so that cilia helps do that. Okay, so excuse me, in the news, there's a lot of stuff about the upper respiratory tract, right? The idea is that, the coronavirus, flu, cold viruses, those end up being an infection of the upper respiratory tract. How this works is you end up with your nose on the outside, gathering in gases. The nasal cavity and the sinuses all connect and communicate here, which is why when you've got flu, cold, corona, any of those viruses can end up infecting that portion, and that's where you've got that upper respiratory infection. And then you've got the pharynx and the larynx. These are the two that end up pushing things through. This ends up separating later into the digestive system, which we'll talk about in this PowerPoint as well. And then the larynx, which actually lets air pass through, and that makes the sound of your voice. Okay? And so the lower respiratory tract is going to be basically what we call the respiratory tree, right? It's that trachea I mentioned, right? So it's that tube down there. and then those bronchi, and then those little tinier ones, the bronchioles, and eventually the alveoli. Okay, and so they're all supported by these C-shaped cartilage rings, right? So it's got these little C shapes there, and that's what helps allow things to pass through. And the food passes down the esophagus, whereas the bronchioles, they're the parts that actually do the gas exchange down further in. And eventually it all terminates, that's where it ends, right? That word right there, in the alveoli. That's the big thing here. Now, one thing you're going to see that we're going to talk about is that respiration in different species changes quite a bit. So for us, it's a pretty simple process, or not simple, but it's a pretty clear process. But as we saw when we dissected the grasshopper, it's quite a little bit different for insects and other animals, right? So for them, they have these little tubes that they have multiple trachea. So we have that one trachea tube that leads down to our lungs. They've got multiple trachea, but they don't have cartilage supporting theirs. There's this chitin, right? Remember we talked about how chitin tends to be their version of cellular storage, or carbon storage. And so that gas exchange is then done in the individual cells. So for them, they don't have blood transporting the oxygen. They have that hemolymph, and that's not their main function there. So the oxygen is actually transported cell by cell. So you can see here in the coming diagrams. There it is. You've got the multiple trachea, and we saw when we were dissecting the grasshopper that they had these little spiracles, right? So you can kind of see here, these little trachea then separate, and they go into these little air sacs where they end up coming in contact with many of their cells. So that's how they're able to do their gas exchange. So it's a little different from us. Now, for us, we do breathing, right? So we've got the same for mammals and reptiles, and even other larger reptiles like crocodiles and stuff, but it is a little different for birds. Okay, so we'll show you what birds look like in a second. But the idea is that air moves in, okay, and then it's got negative pressure. Basically what you're doing is you're creating more space for the air to kind of push down in, right? And because of the diaphragm, the muscle there, it ends up allowing those ribs to kind of move and expand, and so the lungs can then flow and allow the flow of air, into the cavity, and that's what allows it to go in. So that's inspiration. And so that's what this diagram is showing. So the rib cage moves up and out because that diaphragm muscle will then start to drop down, okay? And once it drops down, that pressure will then be able to go up in the lungs, and that causes our air to come in. So that's how inspiration works. Expiration is a little different. It's basically the opposite. You've got increased pressure because the muscles of the diaphragm are now pushing up, and so that allows for the space to run out, and then the lungs end up forcing more out. So you can see that here, and that's what this looks like. You've got your diaphragm relaxing, and so it moves up. So when it's pushed down, you're causing those muscles to contract, but when you let it loose, that moves up, and that's what causes that air to then push out. So because the lungs don't have as much space, so that ends up carrying out of there. And so for humans, our air moves in and out through the same route. Birds are different because they have a one-way system. Basically, they're, for us, it would be go in, and then come back out, same pathway. For birds, it's a little different. They go in one direction, and it goes out. So it's very different. It's a continuous system. So you see what that looks like. So for the birds here, they've got their trachea, right? The air pushes through into the lung, and the lung carries the air to the abdominal sacs, okay? Once the air goes to the abdominal sacs, it then moves to the thoracic sac, so it's right there in the abdomen. Then it moves to their chest, and then in their chest, it moves back out through the trachea a different way. So it's a very different system, but it is, and the reason it does that is so it can be more efficient, so they can do things like flying, and they can have high energy because they need more oxygen exchange. So that's their method. Okay, and so for us, the whole reason we do this is so that we can end up with a balance of pH, right? So in chemistry, you learned about ions, right? So here's the hydrogen ion, right? Positively charged. If we end up having too much, then the breathing center in the brain up here tells the body you need to increase the breathing rate. What that does is it allows for CO2 to leave more and then more to come in of oxygen, and that will then change our pH of the blood. So that's something that's important and why this occurs. Okay, and so the whole point of all this is to have an external exchange of gases. For us, we have this pretty subdivided system, but other animals like amphibians and reptiles, they have different methods of doing this exchange. So I mentioned in previous chapters, frogs and salamanders, they have these moist body surfaces, and that allows for more gas exchange. For us, it's all about our alveoli, right? So you'll see in a diagram coming up here. But basically, it's going to look like these little grape sacs in the middle of our lungs, right? So that's at the end of our alveoli, but it's surrounded in a little capillary bed. So think of it like this. It's kind of like a webbing of blood vessels. And so these blood vessels are all wrapped around kind of one little pocket of cells. And because of diffusion, the gas is able to pass in and out. Okay, and so that's an important thing to understand. So this looks like a messy diagram, but you're going to see it in the next one. It's much clearer. So here's what it looks like, right? Your bronchiole is right here, allowing the gas to go through. So you breathe in, right? The oxygen then fills these little grape sacs. Okay, they've got a lot of surface area. That's why they've got all these little folds around, right? Well, that surface area allows for the CO2 to go back in here, and then you breathe it out, right? So that CO2 goes out, and that O2 is moving in, right? Well, what that does is it oxygenates the blood so that it can go to the heart and then get pumped to the rest of the body. So this is a really good way of doing this, but it all occurs down here in the alveoli. That's the important thing. And so the blood flow is pretty simple. So you've got these pulmonary arteries or arterioles, and it comes through and it mixes. And then over here, because of the gas exchange being so close, it's able to pick up oxygen and release that CO2. So the CO2 goes this way, and then the O2 goes this way. And that's what ends up reoxygenating it. And then it goes down to the heart so it can be pumped to the rest of the body. So this is a really good system, and this actually is a good example of what happens throughout the rest of the body. Those little tiny arterioles and capillaries, they're the ones that do the gas exchange, and it's all through diffusion. Every cell has these, but it's particularly important in the alveoli or the alveolus. So this is pretty similar to what happens to fish, except for them, they're not worried about breathing in the air. They need to have water that has air in it, or oxygen. So what they do is they have all that little surface area. We saw a lot of that. We were looking at it, not in the fish, but we saw it in the crayfish, right? And also the squid and the clam. They had all these little gills, and the pharynx for the fish passes across, and it allows that water to go through, and they're able to absorb the oxygen in there. So, excuse me. So one thing you're going to notice is, or that I mentioned before, is fish do not get the O out of H2O. Okay, that's not how that works. What they do is you've got all your little Mickey Mouse molecules. Okay, remember those, the water molecules. Okay, so there's your O, your H's. Right. So these things, what they do is in between, you've got little molecules of O2 hanging around. So you'll get several of these Mickey Mouse looking molecules, right? And all around them you've got O2. Well, the fish breathes in those O2 molecules, and that's what they're looking for. So you'll see how that works in this one. And so the water passes over into the mouth, and then it flushes over the gills, and then over the gills the water then passes through the rest of this. Okay. And so as that water's passing through, what's in these little folds in the gills, you've got your veins and your arteries doing almost the same thing as the lungs, only now instead of it having this pocket of air building up, it's just the water flushing over it, giving it that ability to do gas exchange. And so for us, the big thing that's carrying this, and the reason why blood is so red, is because of hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin is this thing that's got a bunch of polypeptides around it, 4 of them, and the main molecule is iron. Okay, iron's able to absorb that oxygen. So, excuse me. One thing that happens with women in particular is when they have menstrual cycles, you lose a lot of blood and you lose a lot of that iron. So that tends to be an anemic thing. So if you tend to have anemia, it's because you're low in iron because you're not able to absorb as much oxygen. So your doctor may end up prescribing medication that has iron, or they may end up prescribing a diet that's high in iron. And that's what you'll end up with more of that hemoglobin, because each of those red blood cells has a ton, 250 million of them, and it's able to then give up oxygen when certain tissues need it and absorb it and carry it around. And the whole point of this is to be able to lower and maintain pH, right? Our blood has buffers in it, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the kidneys and the urinary system, but those buffers are maintained because of oxygen and CO2 exchange. So here's what that looks like, right? These kind of orangish molecules down here, zoom in. Here's the iron, and it's got the iron ion, right? So it's positively charged, and it attaches to these O2s, right? So you see the double bond there? Those O2 molecules, they're the ones that are able to spread and share to the rest of the body. So this is an important chemical reaction to understand, but the idea is that if you remember anything about chemistry, right, carbon dioxide combines with water and it forms carbonic acid. But one thing you have to understand is when this carbonic acid is in a liquid, it ionizes. It does not stay as an acid by itself. It ends up becoming this hydrogen ion, and this is the key one here, but this bicarbonate ion, okay? That's how we're able to transport CO2 through the blood. So when your pH is low or high, it changes how much this bicarbonate, and basically it runs this equation backwards. Okay, so we're able to get the bicarbonate to get through this carbonic acid, combine it with water, send it to the blood, and then out here the carbon dioxide gets sent out to the lungs. Okay, so that's the big deal. And again, so I find it funny when people are like, oh, I'm going to drink this drink, it's going to alter my blood pH. I'm on a cleanse so that this will go this or that way. That really can't be done. The body is doing this on its own through the respiratory system, the circulatory system, and you're going to see as well the urinary system maintains the pH and the salts as well. And so how the urinary system works is pretty simple. It's got three big functions. You've got kidneys that are going to be excreting nitrogen. So that's this big deal. Nitrogenous waste is nitrogen. For us, it's urea and uric acid. Other animals, it's different things. If you've ever had a fish tank with fish that maybe didn't do so great, that's probably because they ended up with too much nitrogenous waste. For them, it's ammonia, right? It's ammonia buildup. For us, it's urea and uric acid. And the whole point is to do two things: maintain our water salt and our acid-base balances. So if you look at it right here, you've got our systems again, but this time instead of focusing on the lungs or the heart is still the main thing here, moving stuff. It's the kidneys that we're going to do the big job here. They're the ones that are going to get our metabolic wastes out. Okay, and so for us, urine is the big deal. That's the way we get our nitrogenous waste out. So for males, they've got one pathway. It's the urethra. The urethra carries sperm through ejaculation, but it also, for the most part, carries that urine from the urinary bladder out. And then for females, they actually have a separate system. So the urinary system and the reproductive system are more complicated and more different. And so we'll talk about that when we talk about reproductive systems later, but we're not the only ones that actually do this stuff. So birds, reptiles, they have a bladder that empties into one opening called the cloaca, okay? So, if males have that urethra that does the two jobs, the cloaca for these other animals basically is a one hole does everything, right? It's their digestive excretion, their urinary excretion, and for their genital tracts. So, I don't want to say they're more simple, but they have the one spot, and we have a little bit more complex things for ours. So that's a cloaca for those animals. Okay, so here's our system. It doesn't show right here, but this is the urinary bladder down there, right? So that's little pocket right there, and that would then end up passing through a tube for the urethra. And if there's a male down there, that would be a penis, and then that would be the urinary opening for the female, right? And so, but here it is. It all starts with the kidneys, the function over here, and then those kidneys end up passing through the ureter down here on both sides. So that's a double filtration system. Works out pretty well, which is why, since we have two, many people can opt to donate a kidney and it'll still work, because it is the one system that's pretty well doubled up. And so for us, the big thing about a kidney, the ones I want you to understand, are these little things called nephrons. Okay, nephrons, they're the ones that produce the urine. They're these little tiny molecules inside the renal medulla, and they're the ones that end up collecting that urine in the pelvis, and that's what we're talking about. So that's the big deal in the human kidney. So as you can see, right, so here's our renal artery, and so it needs to have a lot of blood flow. But in that kidney, if you zoom in a bit, up here at the top, you've got these two little nephrons, right? These little sections right here. Well, these nephrons, they're the ones that have the main parts, right? So you've got the outer portion, then you've got the renal cortex and the renal medulla. And so this portion right in here, in the renal pelvis, is where the urine collects, but over here is where the reactions are done to actually filter the blood. Okay, and then of course it goes down the ureter to be excreted later. And so what's a nephron? Okay, so the nephron is this thing where blood is filtered. It's these little tiny cells, and they're composed of these little small passageways that basically they have to have a lot of energy. So they use a lot of mitochondria, right, in the proximal tubules, and they have these little microvilli, which are little kind of folded spaces in there. Well, the nephron loop is the thing that ends up basically allowing it to kind of undergo these reactions, and then it goes through the distal tubule to finally end up connecting to these several nephrons, and then the urine builds up in the renal pyramid. That's the big deal. Okay, and then once the nephron has its own blood supply, it's able to do that exchange and form the urine over and over and over again. So again, the nephron, the big thing to take away here is the nephron does the big job, collects stuff in the renal pyramid, and that's where the urine ends up passing through, eventually through the ureter. Okay, and so here's kind of what that looks like. So the one on the left is our overview of the system, right? So there's the urinary system all laid out. Okay, so you can see it was in the bad picture earlier, but it's right there. So there's a urethra. Okay, and then over here is our renal artery, and that, as we zoom in, gets to our two nephrons, and these are what they look like. Okay, so this is a very complex system. I'm not going to expect you to memorize every single one of these, but the big idea here is to understand that you end up with its own blood flow. Okay, it's got its own blood flow so that it's able to pass through, and all these little loops, what these loops are doing, these kind of yellowish loops, is they're allowing for all of that to pass through and get filtered. Then that blood that was been used up, it passes out and goes that way. And then down here in the renal cortex, that's where the urine is stored. So that would be where the urine is, in the urinary pelvis, excuse me, not renal cortex, so urinary pelvis. And so that ends up building up down there. Okay, and the nephrons do this at the same time, and they have to have that constant blood flow so that they can filter and take everything they need out of the blood and get it ready to go on. Okay. And so the main things that happen in those loops are going to be filtration. Okay, once the filtration occurs, you end up basically getting all those little small molecules that you want out, or that you don't want out, and so that's going to exchange the water, the nutrients, the salts, and of course generate the urea. And then from there, you want to make sure you don't lose too much during that filtration, right? So what they do is they actually reabsorb some of those solutes back. So solutes here means salts. Okay. And so the reabsorption of this allows for you not to lose too much salt and end up getting dehydrated, things like that. Depending on how much water you're drinking, that can change all those. Actually, I misspelled salt, so that looks like I misspelled it, sorry. But the point is, you need to have that active transport happening. So lots of energy is required for this. And then, of course, finally, once you've got the stuff you want out, you can then secrete it, right? So that becomes a bunch of uric acid, hydrogen ions, ammonia, even penicillin can get out there. And so that ends up getting rid of all those harmful substances, and finally it ends up getting secreted. So those big 3 steps are important, okay? And so there it is. There's kind of a clearer look at our nephron and how it works. But it's pretty simple, right? So the blood's coming in from the renal artery, and there's the little capillaries. And in these loops, right, so you've got filtration right there, that first step. After it's filtered, you do have some reabsorption of water nutrients back to the blood, okay? Once it goes through this mesh of systems, through the loop, right, you end up with secretion of certain amounts, and that ends up going down into the urine, okay? And some water does get reabsorbed again into the medulla. And then finally, once all that blood's been used up, it goes to the renal vein to go back to finally getting reoxygenated later. So it's really important that you understand that this whole loop in the nephron is all about these 3 steps. So if you take away anything from these last couple slides, it's these 3. Okay, filtration, reabsorption, secretion. And so why is all this happening? The whole point is you got to maintain your salt-water balance and your pH, right? We have to be able to regulate. Remember the term osmolarity from the first semester? Osmolarity just means the amounts of salts and water in there. And so keeping that within your normal limits, that homeostasis, again, that's that big key term, right? Homeostasis. If you can remember that, then you're on the right track. So that homeostasis maintains through that. So for us, these long nephrons can create what's called hypertonic urine. Basically, hyper meaning it's got a lot of salt in it. And so we pump all that salt out, and because of that, we end up having to drink quite a big amount of water, right? Some chemicals we drink can also be what we call a diuretic, and they interfere with some of these things and can lead to more water loss. So coffee does that. So, if you drink coffee quite a bit, that's not a good thing, because you end up making you need to go create more urine, which means you have to pee more. And so besides that, I mentioned this earlier when we're talking about the blood, bicarbonate is a big deal too, right? This is our buffer system. It helps us get that pH maintained. So the kidneys actually secrete a bunch of these acidic and basic substances to help us maintain that. That's why I mentioned. So, if you've ever met somebody, or you yourself may have tried to drink a certain, beverage, or eat a certain amount of food to adjust your pH, that's not something your body does without their kidneys, right? So the kidneys do the job for you. They are really good, and they provide a buffer. Okay, that's a key term here. A buffer just means it's something that allows your pH to stay the same throughout, right? And so if the blood tends to be more acidic, then we end up releasing those hydrogen ions, and the bicarbonates are reabsorbed to balance it out. If it's more basic, then it's the opposite, right? We don't excrete the ions, and the bicarbonate doesn't get absorbed, so the blood then becomes slightly more acidic and it balances back out. So it's a nice little system to keep itself under control, right? And so a lot of the times ammonia tends to be the toxic byproduct, right? And so that's one way that we can end up providing buffers for these and getting these things out. Many animals have to deal with ammonia instead of creating the urea like we do. All right, so here's an example of another organism doing this. So you've got our grasshopper, and they have these things. It was hard to see in the dissection we did, but they have these little tubes called Malpighian tubules. Okay, they're in their gut, and what they do is they allow for an acid-base balance. So if you look kind of closely to this one over here, you'll see that what they're doing in these little tubes is they're allowing for the water to pass through, and it's taking the wastes out as needed, okay, but it's allowing some of the water to pass through. And for them, it's not about sodium and chloride. They use salt. In their form of salt, it tends to be potassium, okay, and so that helps kind of keep their acid-base balance as well. So it's not always the same as us, but they still have a system to do that as well. And so for them, here's the explanation again. The Malpighian tubules, they have this uric acid that builds up and it diffuses into their hemolymph, right? And so what they do is their salt gradient is by moving that potassium ion, K+, and it ends up passing through, and they have a little bit of a uric acid as well, leaving their body, but for them it's just an anus, so a little different than ours. Okay, and so here's what it looks like, right? So we've got the hydrogen ion with the ammonia, and that makes that ammonium over here, so NH4+. And so they do have little kidney tubules. It's a little different from us. We have these really complex nephron loops. They've got just these little surface area built in there to help move that carbonate ion. Okay, so occasionally you can end up with problems in your kidney functions, right? So what happens is those main little tiny cells, the nephrons, can be damaged. And so a lot of the times you'll end up seeing with albumin, which is a protein, or red blood cells or white blood cells build up in the blood, and then we can see, and that those cells from the blood can build up in the urine, and if they show up in the urine, then you can see that there's damage. So, excuse me, but 2/3 of those nephrons can become inoperable, which means that the waste is going to start accumulating in the blood. So there's different ways of getting around this, but kidney transplant tends to be the main thing, right? We all have to have at least one functioning kidney, but excuse me, but we can actually live with just one kidney as long as the body is maintained. So if it comes from a relative, you can live a year or longer with those kidney transplants. That's why a lot of the times when those things happen, they ask you to check with a relative to see if they can help. So one other way that you can have issues with the kidney is if you have to have dialysis or hemodialysis, right? So what this is basically your kidney has failed to do its job. And so what they do is they insert a dialysis tube, and they are able to let the blood pass through this solution called dialysate. And the purpose for that is that it allows for the concentrated stuff in your blood to switch with the dialysate and vice versa, so that basically it serves as a way to filter things out. It removes harmful substances, and it can be used also to add good substances. This type of treatment happens once a week, and once your kidney is into this semi-failure, it's unfortunate, but you have to do this once a week pretty much to the end of time. This happens a lot with diabetics. Okay, and so here's how this works, right? So you've got the blood flow coming out of the body, right? And so that blood flow will pass through, goes through this pump, and it goes through this semi-permeable tubing, this osmosis tubing. And what it does is it has this dialysate come through, and it allows for an exchange. And so the used dialysates pass out right here with all the urea excess salts. And then afterwards it's done, the blood is then reinserted back in, now filtered out. Okay, so that's an artificial kidney machine or dialysis machine. Okay, so the other system we're going to talk about in this one is the digestive system, right? So the other two are about filtering. Digestive is about getting what you need out of your food, the nutrients and the water, and then eliminating stuff that's not digestible and passing it through. So again, this is all about keeping things pretty steady as we go, and this time instead of working on the respiratory or the urinary system, now we're talking about the digestive system. So it's about food going in and any indigestible waste coming out as feces. So there's a certain, just like we were talking about with respiratory systems and how there's a closed and an open respiratory system, well, or circulatory system, there can also be an incomplete and complete digestive system, right? So we mentioned these species earlier in previous chapters, but a Hydra and a planaria, they've got this body sac, right? So their mouth is their entrance and their exit. There's no passageway through the body. It just goes in, they take what they need, and then it comes out, right? Most other animals have a complete digestive system with a mouth and an anus. And the whole purpose of this is to be able to get things through and digest stuff and not have to have the same opening do the same job. Right? So this is what a complete digestive system looks like, right? You've got your body wall, your coelom, your body cavity, your digestive tract, right? And then you've got a mouth and an anus on one side or the other. So we saw that in the earthworm. They have a full, complete digestive system. And so that's one way that this ends up getting done. So for vertebrates, our plan is pretty much the same as the earthworm. You've got this specialization, it passes through these extracellular processes, digestive enzymes come in, they take what they need, they produce what they need, and then from there, the food ends up passed through. Now, one thing I want you to understand is we've got all these other accessory glands, right? You're going to see some of those in a minute. The accessory glands do not have any food in them. It's only within the digestive tract. The accessory glands tend to just produce hormones or absorb certain nutrients from the food. So you'll see that in a minute. And so here's our system. So you've got that pharynx. We talked about that and how it's a big part of the respiratory system. Well, our food will go in through that mouth and then it'll pass through the pharynx, and from here it goes down the esophagus, but instead of going down the respiratory tract, it'll go past the diaphragm and then into the stomach, and then you'll have all these other organs like the liver, the gallbladder, the duodenum. There's a little curve towards the beginning of the intestine. Then you've got the large and the small intestine. And then once it's all done, that goes past to the colon and then the rectum, and then finally out as waste, right? So the mouth is the first part of the digestive system. The teeth can tell you what the animal's diet is about. So birds don't have teeth, right? Dinosaurs did, but birds, what they do is they have a gizzard. The gizzard inside is this little organ that usually has like little grinding parts that breaks apart their food. We as omnivores, we eat both plant and animal material. Herbivores have flatter teeth for extensive chewing. Carnivores tend to have sharper teeth for biting and tearing. Okay, we as omnivores have some that are just a little bit of both. Okay, and so how this works. So carnivores like cats, they have really enlarged canines, right? Those are for killing their prey, for making sure that it's gone, and then from there, these little short incisors, the scissor types, they're the ones that scrape the bones and get what we need. Then the jagged molars are for tearing those flesh apart. Okay. Now for herbivores, theirs are a little different. This one's not a great picture. It got kind of cut off here, but they usually tend to have these sharp incisors for clipping, and then flat molars and premolars. Those are for the grinding. Okay. And for humans, we're interesting because we have a little bit of both, right? We end up having those teeth like the carnivores, but then our back teeth are like herbivores. So we really truly are omnivores. So our front teeth are able to do the tearing and cutting, but then our back teeth are able to do the chomping like the others. So this would have been a horse one. You would have seen that their incisors and canines are pretty sharp for cutting in the front, right? They're little flat kind of squares, okay? But then in the back, they stay pretty flat all the way through. It's a really bad drawing, but you get the picture. And so for food, why do we take it? It's got the four main things, right? The carbs, the proteins, some of the stuff that make our nucleic acids, and our lipids. And so we need to break those things down to be able to use them for the rest of the body. And the first thing that does this, so the teeth do the physical breakdown, but the saliva is involved in the chemical digestion, right? So we have enzymes like amylase. That enzyme breaks things down into our starch and our maltose. Then it's mixed and chewed into this thing called a bolus, okay? And then it's swallowed, okay? So that stuff that you swallow in your mouth, that's a bolus. And then from there, it passes down. Now for us, our taste buds allow us to taste the food and tell us whether it's good or bad. So some animals know this, or not know this, but some animals have evolved to taste bad so they don't get eaten. Monarch butterflies do this. One monarch butterfly may get eaten by a certain animal, but then it'll get a really bad taste in its mouth and it won't want to eat it anymore. So that's a way that our digestive system works too. Okay, and then of course the swallowing portion, right, for us, we have to it all ends up coming together into the pharynx, right? So for us, it separates out. The food is swallowed, and the soft palate moves to close the nasal cavity. So, you're not really breathing when you're swallowing at the same time. That's not possible. And if you do, that's when stuff can get stuck, and you can end up choking, right? And so in the esophagus, that stuff starts to move down, connecting the stomach, and this is where peristalsis starts, right? Peristalsis is the movement of your muscles that allow it to push down through, and you're going to see a lot of that through the rest of the system. Okay, and so there's kind of the steps as you go from top to bottom. And so down here, the soft palate ends up closing up over here. So when you swallow food, that passes through down here. This closes up, and then it passes down past the glottis and the larynx and down the esophagus to get digested. So that's a different way of closing things up. Right, and so there's the food mass. It passes through. You'll see right there that our soft palate starts to close, and then as it's fully done, then it's able to allow some passage of that food down the rest of the way. Okay. And so once it gets down there, it gets to the stomach, and in the stomach, that's where it starts to stretch. And so, you end up tend to having about a 1 liter capacity in your food, in your stomach. And that's when you get the protein digestion. So these digestive juices starts to build up. It's got mainly it's hydrochloric acid, okay, and pepsin. Okay, it's a protein that breaks things down. And so it breaks them down to peptides, and from there, when you get heartburn, that gastric juice tends to kind of back up into your esophagus. So if you get that pain, they also call it acid reflux. That's basically when the acid is moving its way up instead of staying down in the stomach like it's supposed to. And so that mucus protects us from that gastric acid juice. And so when you get an ulcer, that's when you've got a bacterial infection that's really tough. It can actually live in the layer of the stomach, and it's an open sore inside there. So that's a unique thing. And so there's the stomach. And as you can see right there, the stomach is basically this big patch of muscles. And as that stuff goes through, the cardiac sphincter is right there, right? And it passes down into the muscle. And in here is where all the digestion occurs. So you basically end up with kind of like the food passing through, and there's a little pinch. And then once it keeps on going all the way through, it ends up passing all the way down through the bottom until it's done, and then it hits the duodenum, which is a little curve right before you get to the intestines. Okay. That's picture's a little cut off there, but it's mostly the same thing. Sorry. And so some animals are a little weird, like the cow. The cow is not like us. We have one stomach, but cattle, sheep, goats, deer, buffalo, they have a rumen. Okay. And so basically they've got a pocket in there with bacteria and protozoans that help break down cellulose. So they eat a ton of grass, right? And they need to be able to get the energy from the grass that we don't. So they have this pocket in there that has the enzymes that are released by microbes, and it forms this big ball of cud, or cud, but I think it's cud. But basically the point is that stuff returns to the mouth, gets rechewed, and then gets passing to the other chambers of the stomach. And the final chamber is the one that does the protein digesting. So here's a good look at what that looks like. Right? So you've got that cud comes up, right? So there's the food, passes through, okay, goes down into the rumen. The bacteria then will break it down, or the protozoans or whatever's in there. Then it comes back up and gets rechewed, and then it goes down again into your antechamber, and then your true stomach, and then passed down through the intestine. So you see, their stomach is weird. It's not like it's not like it's got like 4 different little like sacs of stomach, right, connected by a tube or anything like that. No, that's not how it looks. It's this one big like giant heart-shaped thing that's a really complex system. And so for the first thing that comes up is the small intestine. Okay, so once things have been digested and in the stomach, now you've got this thing called chyme, right? And so the small intestine is all about digesting the nutrients, okay? Large intestine is about the water, but the small is about the nutrients. So it absorbs all those nutrients. And the first part is called that duodenum. It's that little curve, okay? And there you get all these accessory glands. You've got the gallbladder, okay, and liver. They make bile, and they store it. And those bile salts break down fat through this thing called emulsification, right? And it allows for this to be able to be used through digestion and gets more nutrients from it. The pancreas produces these hormones that are able to neutralize stomach acid, right? So because when things pass through that stomach, it's going to be pretty acidic. So the pancreas actually does that, and it creates amylase to help digest these starches and maltose and sugars, right? It also makes trypsin to digest more proteins, lipase to digest fat into glycerol and fatty acids. Remember those? We made those at the beginning of the year with that chain with the 3 fatty acids, okay? So they use that lipase to break that down, and it creates nuclease to digest the nucleic acids, and we can use it to make our own nucleotides, right? So the pancreas, you're probably familiar with it when it comes to, insulin, but it does so much more, so much more. Okay, so there it is, right? So there's our stomach, the acid chymes passing through, and there's our gallbladder, which is storing that bile that's made from the liver. And the bile duct is passing through, and there's our pancreatic juice producing all of the other enzymes we were just talking about as this stuff is passing through. Okay, and that's first curves of the small intestine. And so in the small intestines, you end up with all these little finger-like projections. They're called villi, right? So if you've got a little tube there, they look a little bit like little fingers right there. So they're called villi, right? And what that does is it basically allows for more surface area for things to be absorbed. So you've got nutrients getting absorbed by the body, which is a big, big deal. It's just got all these folds and villi, and then on each of those, you've got little microvilli, which are even smaller, okay? So if you take a look right here, right, so there's a small intestine, and so you see it's got these kind of little curves right there. Well, if you zoom in, those tend to have their own little mini curves right there for more and more surface area. And as you zoom into those are the villi, right? And so there again, you've got to have blood passage through to get the nutrients where it's got to go. But you've got these little blood capillaries mixing through, and right here you've got that lymphatic capillary as well, and all these little tiny epithelial cells. But as you get closer and closer, you zoom in, take a look, microvilli. So little tiny folds. And that ends up producing a lot more surface area so you can absorb those nutrients. And so one thing you'll find is that depending on what kind of animal you are, so there's our deer, right? It's a ruminant, so it's got that weird heart-shaped stomach, right, with all the weird passages. Well, they tend to have really long digestive tracts. The reason for this is because it's really hard to process plant material, okay? Carnivores tend to have really short digestive tracts. The purpose for that is it's really easy to get the nutrients that you need out of meat. So that's a very big difference in the two types of animals. Now again, what are the villi for? Absorption. So that absorbs the nutrients. The sugar and the amino acids go through these blood capillaries, and they end up in the hepatic portal system, right? So that's the vessels connecting the liver to the rest of all this. And again, our glycerol and fatty acids, they enter this thing called the lacteal. Basically, they get dumped in with the lymph, okay? And the absorption then occurs by diffusion. So that's the big deal. So widening all that surface area so things can just pass across the cells. And some active transport. Active transport does involve using some form of energy for that. Excuse me. Then you get to the large intestine. The main thing about the large intestine is water, right? You want to be able to get water and absorb that as well. Some animals actually never drink water, or hardly ever. They actually absorb their food from the water. So, the tortoises that were in my room, they don't need to have water all the time because they are able to actually just get the water from the food, right? And that happens in absorption during their large intestine. So you get water, the salts, and some vitamins, little tiny molecules. But the whole idea is it's about storing the indigestible material so it can be eliminated to the anus, right? So it's called the larger intestine or the large intestine because it's bigger, not that it's longer, right? And so we tend to also have this little pouch called a cecum with an appendix. They think the appendix used to have a bacterial population for maybe digesting either plant or animal material back when we were more carnivorous or more herbivorous. But now it's vestigial structure, doesn't really help us. But one thing all large intestines do have is E. coli. Okay, so E. coli is good in some cases. It helps break things down and produce vitamin K for blood clotting. Some animals have more E. coli than others, and then you can have some strains of E. coli that are bad that can cause disease and sickness. So we'll talk about those later in nutrition. But one thing you have to understand is feces is mostly water. Okay, so 75% of it is all water, and then about a third of that solid matter, that 25%, 33% of that 25 is bacteria. Okay, and so we end up shedding a lot of our gut bacteria, and depending on what we're eating, the bacteria will grow or die, and they also produce a lot of gas and stuff like that. So mostly it's water that we're getting out of there, and so it's a pretty big deal that we're able to absorb a lot of that in the small intestine and in the large intestine. So, and if we're not able to reabsorb that water, that's where we have diarrhea. And so it's a pretty simple thing, right? So we start up at the top. You should know that general process here. Okay, this is a big deal. So making sure you know this process, that's going to be a big deal on one of our tests. So make sure you take a look at it. But it's a pretty simple one. And then again, some of the accessory organs, we talked about them. So the pancreas, again, it's basically an endocrine gland. It also produces insulin and glucagon, so that's for our sugar levels. And it's an exocrine gland, which produces that pancreatic juice for the duodenum, right? That's what all those other hormones were that we mentioned in the previous slides. Okay, the liver is a detoxifier. Okay, it takes the blood and removes all the poisonous substances. So if you eat something, the liver, excuse me, the liver is the thing that takes all the poisonous stuff or the bad stuff and it detoxifies it. Okay. And then of course you've got plasma proteins like albumin, fibrinogen. It also kills old red blood cells and reuses them to make hemoglobin. Okay. Produces bile for the gallbladder, stores glucose sometimes, and then it can also produce urea for amino acids or from amino acids. Okay, and of course our blood vessels are always involved in this. So the blood vessels, again, getting the nutrients out of the intestines is a big deal. But just like everything else, we've got these little blood vessels, these little capillaries that are absorbing what we need. Okay, and then the big one that we're talking about here is going to be this hepatic portal vein. That's the really big one. And it basically is this big vein that leads to the liver. That helps remove that extra glucose, store it as glycogen. So we can store all that sugar, excuse me, as long as your body's functioning normally, your body can release sugar from that glycogen that's stored away. Okay, and so it can also deaminate stuff, or basically remove amino acid groups. Okay, convert them into urea, and then that's our biggest nitrogenous waste, urea. Okay, and that urea is excreted from the kidneys later on. So there's our hepatic portal system. You've got that inferior vena cava up here, right, going back up. But the main idea is that the small intestine absorbs the stuff down here, okay? Then those nutrients pass through the hepatic portal vein to the liver, and then the liver takes all that blood, checks what's going on in there, if it needs to be detoxified or made into something else. That's what happens in the liver. And then once it goes from there, it goes back to being pumped and so on and so forth. So sometimes your liver does not always work. If you have jaundice, you got a yellowish tint to your skin because you're producing too much bile in the blood. And so that can be an issue there, especially at birth. You can have hepatitis, which is either a viral infection. Okay, if it's hepatitis A, that's a viral infection of the liver. Okay, If it's hepatitis B or C, those are blood transfusion, kidney dialysis, or unsterilized needles. And all of these are sexually transmitted diseases that can be transferred through that way, through the blood and semen. And then you can have cirrhosis of the liver. That's when the organ becomes really fatty. And so you end up with basically scar tissue on your liver. Alcoholics get this, and now we're finding that people who eat too much fatty foods can get this as well. And so, again, what is the whole purpose of all this stuff? You need the energy. Carbohydrates start getting broken down in the amylase, and then they get broken down even further by pancreatic amylase and maltase. Okay. Proteins are basically broken down in the stomach. Okay. Sometimes further in the small intestines by trypsin and peptidase. Okay. And then the fats themselves, those are broken down by the bile salts. They get emulsified. Basically, they end up kind of squeezed out, right? And they're packaged as little lipoproteins and so forth. So hopefully that was helpful, and you'll be able to look through these. But this is one of three. This next test will have 3 chapters in it, so it'll be smaller. I'll be making up a schedule and letting you all know. So make sure you're keeping on track, and hopefully, if there's anything you mistook later on in this PowerPoint or earlier on, you can go back and look through it. So, hopefully that helped, and you guys can hopefully keep watching these and still absorb some of that information. So, anyway, thanks, and you guys take care.